Hello all and welcome to RiskScout's webinar, Confessions of a Former Examiner, How to Pass BSA Reviews with Confidence. We are so excited to have you all joining us here today. Now, before we do dive into today's webinar content, we want to roll through some quick housekeeping items. RiskScout will be sharing all of today's webinar resources in a follow-up email tomorrow morning, so be sure to keep an eye on your inbox. We also want this session to be as valuable for you as possible, so we encourage you to ask any questions that you may have throughout today's session in the questions section of the webinar panel on the side of your screen. We'll also be running a few polls throughout today's webinar to better understand you, our audience, so your participation is greatly appreciated. If you'd like to follow along with today's slides, feel free to grab them from the handout section in the control panel on the side of your screen. RiskScout is a team of former bank examiners, BSA professionals, and fintech developers helping financial institutions grow and be more efficient and profitable. Through a full BSA, AML, and fraud suite, RiskScout solutions increase revenue and decrease compliance costs and losses by unlocking new deposit streams, automating compliance workflow, and catching fraudsters. If you're interested in learning more about how we help community banks and credit unions every day, visit RiskScout.com and get in touch. Last month, RiskScout announced brand new fraud functionality coming to our platform. These rules and integrations help financial institutions of all sizes fight against wire fraud, ACH fraud, elder financial abuse, check fraud, new account fraud, and more, alongside our existing BSA AML solution. With real-time alerts and full fraud management built into a powerful BSA compliance solution, you can prevent losses and better protect your community from financial crime without the headaches of juggling multiple vendors and tools. Visit RiskScout.com to read the full press release and to request a demo to see these new features in action. Next month, RiskScout is collaborating with MyTech Systems to bring you Beyond Detection, building a holistic, real-time defense against check fraud. Check fraud is rising at an alarming rate, with US financial institutions facing more than $24 billion in losses last year alone. As fraudsters grow more sophisticated, traditional defenses are struggling to keep up. It's time to move beyond reactive tactics and implement a real-time, holistic strategy that protects every channel and preserves customer and member trust. Join us for this practical session on how financial institutions are modernizing their approach to check fraud using real-time decisioning, shared intelligence, and advanced analytics. You can register today at RiskScout.com. Today's webinar will be led by none other than RiskScout's own Ryan McInerny, our Vice President of Product Strategy. Ryan leverages his extensive regulatory and technical background to create software solutions that solve critical industry problems. Before joining RiskScout, Ryan served as a national bank examiner at the OCC, where he was a key member of the Northeast District Committees for Compliance and Commercial Credit, working to address challenges facing community banks. We are so excited to have him join us today and to share a little bit about that experience as a national bank examiner. Ryan, without further ado, I will go ahead and pass it over to you to tell us about yourself and dive into today's content. Take it away, Ryan.
All right, thanks, Ethan. So starting off, Ethan wanted me to give you guys a little bit of a background. So these are just some of the things that I enjoy doing. So I'm a big snowboarder, love going into the mountains, also make my own hot sauce. And you'll see that break for moose sign there. I did accidentally hit a moose with my car, so I would highly not recommend that if you have the option. But from there, yeah, let's jump right into it. So on the agenda today, what I really wanted to go through is exactly what your examiners are looking for when they're looking through the BSA side of the house. There's going to be a little bit of variability in that. I think I'll probably add a little bit more context around just some different areas that I would poke around in a little bit more. And these are definitely going to be scoped a bit more specifically based on the risks that your financial institution might have, particularly on prior findings, audits, or maybe you have something specific about your portfolio or your region. So take all these with a grain of salt. I think they can vary a little bit, but these are typically going to be covered. And if you want kind of a blueprint of where the examiner is going to be going, if you look at the FFIEC BSA manual, that's going to have an examination procedures in the back. That is pretty much exactly what people are going to be looking at. So we'll start to jump right into it.
That's right. But before we jump in, we do have our first poll question. You should see that popping up on your screen right now. We want to get a feel for how much time exam preparation takes you and your team at your institution. So you can select any of these that apply. Maybe it's under 10 hours, maybe it's between 10 and 20, maybe 20 and 40, or maybe you're at that very high end and it's taking you over 40 hours, which Ryan considers to be an eternity here of exam preparation. We'll give you all a couple more seconds to get in, help us get a bit of understanding of how your team is approaching exams as they're coming up on your calendar. All right, thank you all so much for those responses. Looks like we got a majority of answers in here, which you should see those results coming up on your screen now. Looks like the majority of our folks are between that 20 and 40 hour range, kind of right down the middle. 42% are spending between 10 and 20, only 8% are spending under 10, 12% over 40. Ryan, I know that you've been in a lot of these banks over the years. How does this kind of stack up to what you were expecting to see?
Yeah, I mean, the exam process can certainly be arduous when you're starting to prepare for it. And there's a lot of niche requests, specific requests, and sometimes that's paper files. Sometimes there's been mergers, acquisitions, and so now you're pulling things out of a shared drive as well as out of your software systems. So it can take a really long time for the prep on these. And I'm sorry that you all have to go through that, and sorry for doing it to you at one point in my career.
Thank you all for those responses. That's excellent. We'll go ahead and dive into some policies and procedures here.
Okay. So policies and procedures, particularly if you have younger examiners, this is going to be the first place that they're going to start off. Generally, if it's a more experienced examiner, they're still going to read through here. But I'd say younger examiners are going to go through it with a more of a fine-tooth comb. Or if you've gotten somebody that's one of those guys that decides they want to find a violation everywhere they go, they're also going to go very, very in-depth on the policies and procedures. The most important thing, in my opinion, when I'm looking at them is whether or not they're aligned with your portfolio. So if you have any high-risk segments, if you have any specific transaction types, and what I mean by that is if you focus on, say, like international wires, remittances, high cash volume, anything like that, I would expect there to be more procedures in place, or at least some sort of process that you're able to manage that a little bit more. Sometimes you might even see one of those procedures, one process might be, I'm looking at XYZ filtering of these transactions to make sure that they're aligning with what I would expect. Geographically, typically I think this is going into like the HIDA, the HIFCA type areas, but there can be some other niche geographical constraints. So if you're in like a border city, border town, or if you're in one of the more prominent like drug trafficking corridors, typically you can see some changes alongside that. In terms of alignment with regs, I put 31 CFR 1010 here because that's going to be broadly applicable, and that's going to include the 5 pillars that you need to have in the BSA program. If you are a national bank, they are going to be looking at you from 12 CFR 21. For that, technically, they actually only have the 4 pillars in 12 CFR 21, and then CDD, EDD, they'll evaluate you through 31 CFR 1010. Probably more detail than anyone needs on that, but what I would be highly conscious of is, are you talking about training? Are you talking about your CDD, your EDD processes, competency? All of that sort of stuff is really important to show in there. From the competency side, typically that's going to be some sort of requirement as who you would be willing to have as a BSA officer, not necessarily saying whether or not you as a person are competent. And the examiners are usually going to look at, say, like your resume or something like that to establish that. And then any of these policies or procedures, if you put some sort of process into place, making sure you have the staff to actually accomplish that goal. We saw a lot of times when earlier in RiskScout, when we were focusing more on the cannabis work, there were some really robust practices that people were putting into place. But in addition to that, they didn't have the staff to do all of that, particularly if technology was breaking. What's the manual fallback if I said I'm going to do XYZ things, but I can no longer do that in an automated way? So just be conscious that that process that you have set up is repeatable and that you do have the staff to complete it. And in the event you were to have attrition or loss of staff, how are you planning on making up that gap? Have you cross-trained people in different areas? Just ensuring that you're able to do what you say you're going to do.
All right, that brings us to our second poll question, which you should see popping up on your screen now. As we're going to talk a little bit about audit and quality assurance, we want to know how thoroughly you're going in and reviewing that audit and QA scope. We'll give you all a couple of seconds to get these responses in, but we want to understand how you're thinking about them before this audit begins. Do you kind of just accept it? You know it's in line with your regulatory requirements. You've checked it. Have you just kind of glanced it over? Or maybe is this the first time that you're realizing you can actually see what those audit and QA scopes look like prior to that audit? We'll give you all just a couple more seconds to get your answers in before we flip them around to talk about them a little bit. Alrighty, a little bit less of an even spread on this response, it looks like. Looks like the overwhelming majority here, 62% say, hey, I've checked it out, I've dove in, I know it's in line with my regulatory requirements. About a third of our audience is saying, you know, I gave it a cursory glance, I understand it, but it looks fine enough for me. 8% of the folks on our call today, I think, are making the discovery that that's something that they can dive into. Probably we're spending, you know, those 40 plus hours on our first poll question in their exam prep and are just simply two heads down there. Ryan, let me ask you, how does this compare to what you were expecting to see?
I think it makes sense. A lot of times there can be, and this is just from experience, I'm not saying this is all of you guys, there can be some complacency in what that scope might be. So maybe the scope was reviewed years ago, and since then there's been some regulatory changes, or maybe there's been changes in terms of what y'all are focusing on, and that scope hasn't grown in adjustment. It's an easy thing to look over, and sometimes we're just not going into the amount of detail that we need to ensure that it's exactly what we want to have covered. So I'm glad everyone is looking at it to an extent. It's an important thing to check out. I think generally, when you're coming in as an examiner, looking at previous findings, so if any of that had come from a previous exam or anything like that, we're immediately going to be looking at that. As you've probably heard in the past, examiners can't follow up on recommendations, but I feel like that isn't necessarily what actually happens. If an examiner has made a recommendation on something and they come back in after the fact, they're probably checking to see what you've done with it. Now, if it's a recommendation, that means it's not, or it should not be escalating into an MRA. But if it was a finding, typically if they had some sort of finding before and they come back and it's a repeat finding, that's going to be significantly worse the second time. So if you do have any meetings with your examiners, say on a quarterly basis, annual, semi-annual, whatever it might be, if there's something you've been working on, you don't think it's going to be completed by the time the exam comes around, it's usually worthwhile at least prepping your examiner about that. Because whoever your portfolio manager is, the person that you're engaging with more frequently, they can provide that context to the examiner that covers BSA. And that might be somebody that's less familiar with their institution or potentially less familiar with your region. When I was an examiner, I was working in the Boston region, so we covered New England primarily. And sometimes you would get visiting examiners from different parts of the country. We had somebody that was visiting from a very high financial crime, drug trafficking area. And they had come up and we were at a bank that was in a pretty low risk geography. And because of that, he had a lot of recommendations, a lot of thoughts about how they should adjust their program because he was so used to such a risky area. So my point in that is providing this context ahead of time instead of letting, say, the wrong examiner find it and then bring it to your examiner in charge is going to be a much more happy path. For us, when we're examining, when we look at the audits, it gives us a nice snapshot into what's working and what's not working. If you've had the same auditor for say 10, 15 years, typically they're going to look a little bit harder at what the auditor was actually reviewing, particularly when we're talking about the scope and the coverage. I would say about half of the examiners really dig into the scope. I'd say a lot of them might kind of leave it and assume that is what it should be. But when they are digging into it, they're looking at that against the regulations, but they're also looking at it against what your portfolio is and what you're actually working on. So ensuring that coverage is good is really important. If you do have some QA coverage as well, similarly, what's the scope there? How have they been looking at it? What did they sample? An examiner is going to be looking at those work papers about what was sampled, just trying to make sure that the coverage was actually appropriate relative to the findings of that audit or that QA. So sampling, I'm going to go into a lot of detail here. Typically what we sample when we get into the financial institution, any sort of reports that you're making to FinCEN, so that could be 314A, CTRs, SARs, anything like that. We'll be looking at the adequacy of your customer due diligence as well as the enhanced due diligence. And then lastly, these funds flow reports, which are kind of custom created by the examiner. I'll also say something that the examiners get prior to their examination is a packet from FinCEN. That packet from FinCEN is going to tell them different areas that they want the examiner to follow up on. Those could be specific individuals, they could be specific patterns, and a lot of the times that would be things like activity that's mismatched with occupation or potential SARs or CTRs you might have filed and they had some questions about it, or they just wanted some secondary glances on that. When we're talking about CTRs, the first thing an examiner is going to want to do is get some sort of filterable list of transactions. Anytime we can get something into Excel, that's going to be a lot better for us just to figure out what's going on. So they're probably going to request that. We did have financial institutions that would still provide a PDF report, as much as I think they might have hoped that that doesn't become filterable after that. Whoever's the lowest man on the totem pole is now typing a lot of that into Excel or doing something else to be able to analyze it. What we're going to be looking for when we do that kind of cash analysis is we're going to be looking to see, were there any of these transactions that were potentially over the threshold that aren't with a CTR exempt customer that for some reason were missed. CTRs, I don't think I had ever found anyone that had missed a CTR. And if they had missed a CTR, they identified it to me. I didn't identify it to them. So just food for thought on that. We'll also look at the CTRs, just make sure that those are filled out appropriately, you're given the right information, that they were filed within the appropriate timelines. So again, if you can, providing something filterable for them is going to be what they're ideally hoping for. You're probably going to have a much more positive experience with the examiner if you do provide those filterable reports as opposed to just kind of like these snapshots in time. The CTR exempt customer reviews, we'll be looking at those as well. So we'll get a sample of maybe 1 or 2 of your CTR exempt customers if you do have them. And in those, we're going to be checking, did you confirm the status that they are CTR exempt? Have you done the proper filings with FinCEN for that as well? And then lastly, the transactions that you had in the CTR, we should be able to see which transactions are in the CTR. And typically, this is going to bleed directly into an analysis to make sure you guys are looking for, say, structuring, and that those structuring reports are also being made. When it comes to SARs, we are looking at the no SARs and SARs. I'd say no SARs were probably one of the less pleasant things to sample, because it seemed, at least from our perspective, that the documentation on them wasn't as consistent as it might have been with the SARs. So maybe SARs are in some sort of system, like let's say they're using a BSA software, maybe the SARs are all available in there. But the no SARs, for some reason or another, would not be. And so we might be getting a box of paper folders on the no SARs, and then the SARs are somewhere else entirely. When we're looking at the no SARs, typically what we would want to know is, why was this not suspicious? Why are you comfortable with that? A lot of times it's just because you all know the activity of that customer a lot better than we know the activity of that customer. I remember there was one example where we had gone to a financial institution. This individual had, I believe, their occupation was something you would not expect a lot of cash. And they were depositing, say, like $100,000 or $150,000 in cash every summer. And we're like, well, what's going on with this? And it turned out that the individual had bought up all these fishing licenses from all of these different people, and then used those fishing licenses to get some outrageous amount of fish and then sell all of that. So it was totally above board, but without that context and that actually being written into this NOSAR or being stored on the customer profile so that we could see that in conjunction with the NOSAR, I wouldn't have been as comfortable with them not filing the SAR on it. So just making sure that context is available for the examiner to understand what is going on. Now, past that, when we're thinking about alerts, we care a lot about what's the time frame for you dispositioning the alert in the first place. So are you letting those sit there for 30, 60, 90 days, something that's really kind of pushing the bounds there? Or are you pretty good about statusing the alert? And then once you've done that statusing the alert, going through that first review of whether or not this should be a SAR or it should not be a SAR. We'll follow up on those as well, because right there, we're talking about the initial SARs, but we're gonna come back and say, okay, I wanna see a few of your initials. I might wanna see a few of your continuing SARs. And a lot of what we care about are dates, who did what and when, and then we're gonna care about the detail. And that detail is including the transactions as well as why those transactions are or are not suspicious. There are situations where you might have a NOSAR and say, you know, we didn't have enough here to say that it was suspicious. Maybe it didn't meet the regulatory thresholds for filing, but it's something that you guys are aware of and you're continuing to monitor. And maybe that's just stored in the NOSAR, or maybe it's something that you've put a note on a customer profile or somewhere else that just keeps your team aware that there is still something happening here and you're aware of it and the regulators know that you're aware of it. Okay. Funds transfers are one of my favorite ones. So what I would typically do when we would go into a financial institution is I would ask for, say, 30 to 60 days of transaction activity. We'd want all of the transactions that had occurred in that time frame. And from there, we're taking all of the customer information, transaction information, originators, beneficiaries, particularly the locations of those individuals. And what I would say is I'd start filtering. So I'd start using pivot tables, start using something, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's called a Sankey diagram. And basically what I'm doing is saying, from this individual, how many of their transactions are going to different countries. And so I do that filter on every single customer that's in the set. And then I might find somebody that's sending a lot of volume to, let's say like Switzerland or something like that. More so than saying, yes, that's suspicious or no, that's suspicious, what I would do is I'd bring it up to the financial institution and just see if they're aware of those patterns. Our goal really is to try and identify some of those and then just see if you guys also know that those are happening. So food for thought, I mean, doing some of that pivot table analysis just on your own customer base can be really rewarding and provide you a lot of knowledge about what your customers and members might actually be doing. And the examiner is probably going to be doing that as well. We do have some tooling that's built out for us. So you had different people on, say, expert groups or committees that put a lot of this information together. And so when we get that entire list of transactions, we're just plugging it into a tool and it's doing some of that analysis for us. And the examiners are given training on how to use the pivot tables and things like that to try and figure out if there is a high volume moving through an account, but maybe it has a low balance, or if somebody is sending things to a lot of weird locations. If there's missing information in any of the transactions, which we all know there's going to be missing information on the transactions, and that's just part of the issue with the software vendors that we have, and then just trying to maintain information in the core and the teller system and everywhere else. Your awareness that that information is missing is going to be more important than the fact that it is actually missing. And if there is a workaround for it, you can tell the examiners about what that workaround was. If there's not a workaround for it, you can inform them of the technical limitations of your software providers, or whatever the issue might be. But more than anything, I think the important thing here is to be aware of what's happening with your data, be aware of what's happening with your customers, members, and making sure that you're making adjustments to how you manage those customers or members based on their activity. Okay, customer due diligence and enhanced due diligence. I'd say while I was an examiner, the level of detail we would see on the customer due diligence side definitely varied. And I would say throughout my career, it started to get more and more robust, particularly as that fifth pillar for the CDD and EDD was coming more into everyone's purview. On those, what we really want to know is, do you understand what's happening with this individual? I think historically in a lot of transaction monitoring systems, you would see this ask for, say, baseline activity. Well, that I think was a good start and it was kind of helpful. I think more often than not, that baseline activity tended to deviate significantly from what somebody might have said at onboarding, right? How they use the account might change over the years, particularly when you're 5, 10 years down the line. That person's in a different stage of life. Maybe they have a different business or a different job, or they've moved or they've done something else. So those default settings that people are putting in just based on someone's expected activity 5, 10 years ago, I would typically see that as a weakness in just how transaction monitoring was set up. One thing we did when we were building out RiskScout was we had that, so it's based on the current activity. So we would measure that behavior more recently than just trying to rely on what a customer told us 5 or 10 years ago. So take that with a grain of salt, however you might want to approach that. I think it can result in a lot of false positives as well if you have inaccurate setup there on what the default activity is going to be. And when you do have more of those false positives, you have more work, potentially more missed alerts or longer disposition time on alerts. So that kind of snowballs into what the examiners are looking at. In terms of when was the information updated last, I think that kind of aligns with the last bullet as well. So is the system risk-based for when you're updating information? A lot of times we would see for low-risk customers, that might be on an exception basis, or they might be trying to, the financial institution might be trying to send something out every 3 to 5 years to collect information on that. As we all know, for kind of like your standard consumer member or customer, you're not probably going to have the best response rate on updating some of that information. And some of your customers and members might have that tinfoil hat on and they just don't want to give you that information, which if that's annoying to you, go talk to the commercial credit team at the institution as well. They are equally annoyed at that process just for getting information from the customers and members in the loan system. In terms of, is there a system to update the information? A lot of times what we would see is some sort of tickler system where maybe you're using Outlook or using some other process to reach out and try and get that information. The most important thing I would say, whether you're using a software or you have some in-house process, is documenting that you've made the attempts to reach out and when you made the attempts to reach out and how you did that. So whether that was phone, email, or some other methodology to try and get the information from the individual, could have been at the teller line. Systematically storing that so when the examiner comes in, they know that you're trying to update this information. Sometimes you're just going to have a non-responsive individual, but if you've documented the fact that you're looking for it, that's going to give you some brownie points in not getting a regulatory finding on any of that. So what I wanted to pull forward here on the customer due diligence, enhanced due diligence, is this is an appendix from the FFIEC BSA manual. This has been there for a long time, which you can tell just based on how it looks. I highlighted 2 items in here. So the first one at the top, customized transaction profile with tailored monitoring against the transaction profile. So when you're setting up your transaction monitoring system, the financial and the regulatory examiners are going to be looking at how have you split up monitoring amongst your base. You have different rule sets in place for the high risk customers or members. Do you have different rules turned on or off, or maybe configured differently for different industries, right? If I'm looking at my cash intensive customers and I've put them into the general business rule set, I'll see a ton of false positives. Conversely, if I configure my business rule set so I don't get a ton of false positives on the cash intensive customers, then I'm not going to get any alerts on the rest of the business customers or members. So consider how you're breaking out your customers and members into different groups, because if they are not configured correctly, you're going to miss alerts on one or the other, or you're going to be inundated in alerts. The one below that, unique profile specific to products and services used by the customer. This is more about information gathering. So if I had CTR exempt customers or members, if I had money service businesses, ATMs, we saw some other kind of niche areas like people that were financing equipment or people that were selling items that were not as common as other items. Just trying to think of the best way I could word that without giving away too much information. You have to ask questions that are specific to the type of business that they are in. So keeping in mind some tailoring of the due diligence that you're updating relative to the industry and the purpose of the accounts. That can be a little bit arduous, but it is really important. So you can do that maybe with addendums to an existing due diligence update request that you already have. You can do that through the relationship manager. Maybe you can do that at the teller line. But it is important to update relative to what that individual is actually doing and what industry they're in. I'll hammer that multiple times because I think it is really important. This is just an example of how we do it, and I think you can accomplish this in your own ways as well, but just to give you a walkthrough of how this works. So in RiskScout, we use what's called a checkpoint. That checkpoint goes out to the customer or member. You can see here we have that say specific to the ATMs. But the most important thing I think with that is the form is specific to the industry type. And then you see the schedule on the right-hand side. That schedule should be relative to your policy. So if you have individuals in the high risk section and you have scheduled for them to get updated every year, make sure you're actually doing that every year and that you're documenting the fact you are doing it every year. This is just an example of what one of those forms would look like. And again, you should be tailoring these forms to the specific industry or risks of that individual. Now, I'm not saying every single individual has their own form, but what I am saying is that you have forms that are appropriate for different groups of customers or members. And lastly, think about where you're storing this information. If you are putting all your outreach into an Excel doc, or you're trying to save phone records or emails somewhere, if you're not using a software like we're putting these into these bundles, thinking about maybe putting these into a shared drive or somewhere else that's organized so that when you are doing your exam prep, you're not having to pull from 15 different sources. Ideally, if you can pull it from one place and just pull the full customer profile with all this information in it, that's the easiest. If you want to do it in a different way, you can certainly do that. It's just a matter of taking more time on the exam prep. Okay. In terms of reporting, there's a few areas that I think we would typically run into some snafus. One of which would be lack of awareness in changing risk composition in the portfolio. And so this is information I'd say typically on reporting where we're looking at what's being reported to the board or what might be being reported to some sort of committee. So movement between risk scores, composition of the entire financial institution. If you had 20% high risk before and now you have 35% high risk, That'll be something we're looking at, and we'll probably actually ask about that in conjunction with what training have you been doing? Have you had any staff planning to kind of measure up with the fact that you're working in more complex areas? Do you have the same time that you used to have for that sort of thing? So all of that is important. SAR volume, additionally, very important there. Talking about the SARs that did occur, and is that changing? Are there more, are there less, that sort of thing. And then lastly, if you have a SAR or a potential SAR on a board member or a committee member, do you have a process in place to bring that through an impartial group without them finding out about it? If you have potential suspicious activity on somebody, you can't bring that to a committee that they are then on. So that's something we had seen that's just not planned for in the past. It's a very important one to plan for. Okay, we got some bonuses in here. So training for the staff and the board. I would make sure that the staff training is a little bit more detailed than what you're giving for the board training, right? Your staff are the people that are in here every day, always working on this. The board, depending on what their expertise will be, a lot of times that's not in financial institutions. So you're trying to keep them aware of what even is BSA and why do they care about it. So those are typically different types of training. And the examiners will typically be pretty clear about that. I talked about this one before, but evidence of BSA officer competency. I will say this, while it seems kind of silly a lot of times because you guys are like, well, I am competent. There was a situation in my career where we did remove a BSA officer for lack of competency. So this does matter. And I think combination of what your prior experience was, as well as what trainings you're performing, those are going to be usually what someone's reviewing for that. You have to be pretty bad to get removed. So just keep that in mind. And then lastly, are you approving the policies, the procedures? What's the cadence that you're approving the policies and procedures? Typically, we see that done on an annual basis, where there's the review and approval, and highlighting any changes you might be making on the policies and procedures at that same time.
Hey, Ryan, if you don't mind, I actually want to jump in here. We had a question when you mentioned BSA officer competency a little bit earlier in the presentation. And somebody was asking for examples of what might disqualify someone from that. It sounds like this particular person, was kind of, maybe drew the short straw. They were a teller before and then got pushed into the BSA officer role. They feel confident in what they're doing, but they're concerned that this might come up as they're approaching their first exam. It sounds like that's not maybe the lack of competency that you're talking about. Without, I know that you have to have some anonymity as an examiner. Can you maybe give some examples of some of the things that would make somebody not considered competent enough as a BSA officer?
I think a lot of times what we would consider for that, is if you're looking at how the program is being built and it's not aligned with what the financial institution is actually doing. So if you're pulled off of the teller line, let's say you have at least some experience with what BSA was asking for at the teller line. There's a reason that you were picked for that role. So I would assume you get some training, you have at least some support with other people in the financial institution, maybe not in BSA, but just getting those trainings and also being able to work with some of the other people in the bank. For them to be actually incompetent, it would be some pretty major faults in the program where you're missing larger items, typically one of those being something with a pillar violation, and maybe there's somebody that's far, far more qualified than you are, and just isn't training you, isn't working with you, that sort of thing. And each case is different, which is why I'm kind of slow to respond on this, because let's say you're in a rural area, there's not a lot of staffing available where you would find someone that is like an expert BSA person. But you're working through the training, you're growing in that program, you're probably not going to get a regulatory finding for that sort of thing. It's usually pretty egregious, the things that are being missed, and that there's no focus on growth to be able to understand and learn how to manage the program better.
Thank you for that, Ryan. That's super helpful. Hopefully that lets everyone here on the call take a deep breath. You're already on a training session voluntarily, so maybe that counts as a win towards that growth and training there. So thank you for letting me interrupt you right there, Ryan, and I'll let you dive back into it.
Yep. I did add this one in here just because I think it's funny. As examiners, at least at the OCC, to get commissioned, you have to take a multi-100 question multiple choice, as well as a 2-day in-person mock examination. So those multiple choices, we had memorized pretty much every regulation. So one of the interesting ones in that is 12 CFR 7.1. If you are a national bank, you can operate a post office branch. So let's say you're having trouble doing your Amazon returns, might be something to bring up with the board to set up at the institution.
That is excellent. I always love those little quick fun facts that pop up there. That does bring us into our next poll question, which as we kind of talk about what exams look like today in 2025, we want to get a quick pulse check on how your most recent exam compares to exams that you might have had 3, 4, 5+ years ago. We want to get a sense for, was it very similar? Did this most recent exam maybe feel a little bit easier? Did it maybe feel a little bit harder? Or maybe you're not sure. Maybe you're coming into your first exam or just had your first exam and you just don't have that comparison point. Would love to give you all a couple more seconds to get your thoughts in there before we can turn around and talk about it a little bit. Ryan, I'll give you a sneak preview. I would say these results are interesting. Alrighty, okay, wow, that's the most responses we've gotten so far, so I think everyone's excited to share a little bit here. Fortunately well, maybe not fortunately, maybe they were always hard for 60% of people, but 60% of people, they at least have had a recent exam where they knew what to expect. It was pretty similar, but about a quarter of the respondents we have on the call said that their most recent exam was harder than their previous exams. 9% say it was easier, 7% not quite sure for one reason or another. Ryan, I mean, this definitely piques my interest, particularly that 24%. I'm curious, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to share in the chat what's made the exams a little bit harder, I'd definitely be interested in that. You know, it's funny, I feel like a lot of the exams will be similar to past exams, and then sometimes they'll get harder because the agencies seem like they're getting a little bit more lax with pulling in experts from different areas or remote work. So on the one hand, you're getting experts that are kind of being shared throughout the country a little bit more easily without that travel. On the other hand, you have people that aren't necessarily as familiar with your geography or how your financial institution operates, looking at what you're doing. And I think that can be the perfect storm for a lot more difficulty. So be curious if that's what people have actually been finding. I don't expect you all to read this entire thing right now, but the OCC operating plan is published every year. It gives you a relatively good idea of what the agencies are looking at. Most of the agencies are publishing some sort of operating plan every year. And it's my mentor at the OCC always told me this should be the first thing I look at because it's exactly what we're going to be focusing on exams and exactly what examiners are hearing from their bosses. So when it comes to BSA, this is exactly what they're going to be focusing on for BSA. And BSA is one of the priorities in the operating plan. These plans aren't really made in a vacuum. So FFIEC, the other agencies all are kind of talking about this while these operating plans are being made. So looking at one versus the other, I think can give you at least some insight into what everybody is going to be looking at. So for 2025, I pulled out kind of the 4 most important, at least I saw out of there. The first one, that risk-based compliance piece, that effective and risk-based portion that I highlighted and underlined there, that's new. So previously that was not something that was there. I believe that was put in by the AML Act of 2020. So I think you really want to consider what makes your program effective and how have you stratified that relative to risk. Are you identifying risk correctly? Those 3 things are going to be really, really critical on these upcoming exams. Customer due diligence. I feel like there's always more and more scrutiny around this. So just making sure you're getting the information you need to make proper decisions about whether or not a customer member is risky is going to be incredibly important at the beginning of the relationship, and maintaining that information is incredibly important. The beneficial ownership changes, which have been proposed and being worked on for the past 5 years, are still something examiners are looking at, although I feel like you and them might be getting a little sick of that one. And then technology and innovation. There is a little bit more push to adopt, I'd say, more automation softwares or things that can at least make your lives a little bit easier or more structured. The one thing I'll say there, so when I was at the agency and I was on those committees and we were talking about a lot of this stuff, we were talking about some of the dislikes about the technological innovation at the time was the fact it was a black box. We didn't know why things were being caught. I think that is still something that examiners care about. You should know what your software is actually doing and why it's catching information. If you don't, that's kind of a recipe for a problem. And then the other piece there would be configuration. So sure, the software might technically function, but if you have not provided the right information or you haven't set things in a way where they're appropriate for your customers or members, just because you have the technology doesn't mean it's working well. So that configuration of the technology, whether it's RiskScout, whether it's a different vendor for any of these purposes, make sure you're working with either the vendor or a consultant to configure these well. If you know how to configure it yourself, great, but you want to tune those alerts, whether it's the risk scoring system, the transaction monitoring system, and make sure they're functioning appropriately for your customer member base. Okay, so the three main takeaways: organizing and documentation is crucial. If you spend the time throughout the year to put this stuff into a centralized location and organize it, it will make it easier on the exam prep side. But sometimes we just don't have those options. Things just live in different places and we have to hunt them down prior to the exam. We wrote don't get the same warning twice, but you really won't get a warning twice. Typically it's one warning and then the next time it's going to be a regulatory finding. So if an examiner has been a little bit kinder on that and kind of tells you guys, wink, wink, like you really need to get this done before next time, you should get it done because the next time it probably will be an MRA. And then tailor those policies and procedures to your risk profile. This canned out of the box stuff, I think a lot of times we would see that on the policies, and that can be made up to an extent on the procedures, but really you should be thinking about what's important at your financial institution, what are your limitations, your strengths, and you should be building those into the policies and procedures.
Alrighty, that brings us into our questions, and y'all, we have gotten a lot of them, which is excellent. So we do encourage y'all, if you have any questions that you haven't asked yet, use that webinar control panel on the side of your screen. You can submit as many as you would like. We'll try and get Ryan to answer them here live on our call in the time that we have remaining. But if we can't get to your question, or maybe if it's a little too in-depth or we don't want to reveal too much of your information live here on a public call, we'll be sure to follow up with y'all offline after today's session. Now, before we do dive into those, we have one final poll question that's popping up for y'all on the screen now. And that's just asking if you would like to speak with RiskScout about any of the following. You can select as many or as few as possible. I know that if you've had as much fun here listening to Ryan speak today, then you're like me and you want to get on another call with him as soon as possible. This is a great way to do it, to just let us know that you're interested in learning a little bit more. We'd be happy to show you a demo, talk about your program, and make sure that you're as ready for your next exam as possible. All right, I'm going to go ahead and dive into some of these poll questions. Let's see, or excuse me, questions that we got from the audience. Ryan, we got one that said, for the first time in my career, I have been notified that we'll have a new examiner for our upcoming exam. Is there anything I should do to prepare for that? Any insight you can share on that front?
Yeah, I'd say if you have a new examiner, the first thing you should really do is just try and talk to them in advance of the exam. So I'm not sure if you guys are talking about like a new examiner for like your portfolio examiner, the person that works with you every 3, 6, 12 months, whatever that is, or a new examiner in charge of the exam. But really just asking them kind of like, what are they focusing on? Providing them context about your institution that they might not know or might be different than other institutions. So if you guys have a unique way of doing anything, if there have been things in the past that you've worked through with other examiners, bringing those up, because the only way that they're going to know that information is going through every prior report of exam or every prior quarterly follow-up, and they're going to miss something. So trying to give them at least some context as to what you guys do and how that might be a little unique is going to be beneficial.
Excellent. Ryan, I know early in the presentation, you talked about timely alerts and how examiners always want timely alerts. Is that the same for every institution? Does it vary from bank to bank or credit union to credit union? And what did you as an examiner consider as a timely alert review?
Yeah, well, there's two degrees of timeliness. And I think it kind of changes based on the institution for sure. Because if you're doing a lot of, like, let's say you're doing mostly wires, right? I expect you to be looking at that a little bit faster than you're looking at, say, like your structuring analysis. Because when you're looking at structuring or anti-money laundering analysis, that's like past looking anti-money laundering pattern analysis, right? It's not critically being identified at that moment to stop something, versus the wire analysis. I might be looking at that a little bit more frequently, just because it's going to be harder and harder for me to get that money back if it was a mistake or a fraud, if I look at that a week or 2 weeks later. The two things I was mainly thinking on timeliness, so that's the first one. The second one is just how quickly you actually look at the alert. So if you're getting your updates on your wires every day, but you don't look at it for a week later, that's not going to be a regulatory finding, but it's not necessarily the most effective thing in the world. If you start to push out past 20, 30 days for actually looking at alert, someone's going to say something about that.
That makes sense. Thank you for that insight there. You also, I think, on the same slide mentioned the importance of paying attention to those higher risk jurisdictions. Are there higher risk jurisdictions that y'all are paying attention to outside of like HITA, HIFCA, or are those the main ones? Or how do you kind of approach that as an examiner?
I'd say for examiners, we're mostly looking at HITA, HIFCA. The only other thing that we might be focusing on is you have niche populations in the area. So like, let's say Native American reservations, Amish populations, high populations of non-resident aliens. If you do a lot of business internationally, those are kind of the things that we're looking at. If there's a significant difference in the general population of your region relative to what would be considered normal for the rest of the US, we might be seeing if there's any changes in BSA AML risk as a result of that.
Perfect. And Ryan, I know when you were talking, when we did that poll question about has your recent exam been harder, the same, or easier, you asked for a little bit of input on maybe what has made some of those exams harder. We did get some of that feedback. One person said that they're approaching $10 billion in assets, which congratulations for you. They had an examiner that focused on that size of banks for the first time. So that added a little bit of difficulty, a new challenge that they hadn't had in the past. Another person reported that there have been times where they've had more junior examiners that have come and have maybe needed a little bit of assistance and guidance doing their exam, but they did put an asterisk and clarify that that has typically been more on the state exam side and not the federal exam side. I'm curious, Ryan, do those ring true to you, or have you heard similar stories like that in your experience?
Yeah, so as you grow as a financial institution, so credit unions, I think it's over 10 billion is when you guys start getting hit with CFPB. And for national banks, at some point, probably in like the $5 billion range, you get designated as basically a mid-sized bank. In both of those situations, you start having more target exams rather than just your standard 12 to 18 month cycle for a full exam. And those target exams are going to get staffed by more of the experts in the agencies on what that target actually is. So I was the analyst over at American Express for some time. And for that, the way we regulate American Express was we only have target exams pretty much. And so we'd have, say, 10 people come in and they're just looking at IT. We have 10 people coming in, they're just looking at, say, machine learning and AI technologies. So you start to see more of that hyper focus on one area and then spreading that out throughout the year, as opposed to just the one and done report of exam, safety and soundness examination. Yeah, I mean, I think I probably missed something else in there because I went a little much on that, but I think that's the most important piece on there.
Well, somebody else added in about kind of the scrutiny that they received during their recent exams. They said that there was a big focus on BSA and OFAC risk assessments. They were asked to expand it to clearly determine the probability of a violation and to list all of their mitigation efforts. They also had an increased focus on beneficial owners. That actually leads into a different question that we had received about risk assessments, asking if you're making changes to your risk assessment, is that something that you typically need board approval for, or is that okay to just kind of stay in the BSA and compliance department?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I really ever saw the risk assessment going to the entire board, but I could be misremembering that. Committees, typically, they're going to look at changes you might be making to the risk assessment, but if you're making changes that are appropriate for the institution, that makes sense to do and still just kind of bring it forward as part of the annual review that maybe the committee or the board is doing. But I don't think that should stop you from making the change and waiting for the board to approve it when you make the change, unless you're scoping something out entirely, in which case that might be more worthwhile. I think that's kind of a case-by-case basis. Sorry, I'm thinking through my thoughts as I'm answering the question.
We like to see the gears turn, Ryan. That's helpful. I appreciate that. I know we're close on time. I've got one final question for you, if that's okay. Somebody said that they are approaching, they crossed $1 billion in assets. Again, congratulations. Is there anything different that they should expect from those exam expectations as they're approaching their exam next month?
Yeah, I mean, if you cross $1 billion, you're going to be a little bit more, there's more focus on audit. So that scope conversation is going to be a little bit more important. Your auditors need to be independent. So if there was any lack of independence there before, they certainly need to be external. And then your audit committee, I believe, needs to be fully comprised of outside directors. So like if your CEO was on the audit committee, they can't be in the audit committee anymore. A lot of that sort of stuff is what people would be focusing on there.
Excellent. Well, y'all, that is all of the time that we have today. I do want to thank everybody for attending, and a big thank you for Ryan for sharing his expertise with us as a former examiner. I know we didn't get to all of the questions asked today, so we will be sure to follow up with anybody that we were unable to answer live on the call with a direct response, because we want to make sure that you're walking away with as much knowledge as possible to solve the problems that you're facing at your financial institution. Be sure to keep an eye on your inbox. We will be sending out a recording of today's session, as well as the slides and resources first thing tomorrow morning for your convenience. There will also be a brief survey once you close today's webinar where you can give us a little bit of feedback. You can request future webinars. You can get in touch with us. So please take a moment to share your thoughts with us in that feedback form. Finally, if you do have any additional questions, if you want to learn more about RiskScout, if you just want to say hi to myself or Ryan, be sure to come visit us at riskscout.com. Ryan, thank you again, and we greatly hope to see you all on the next webinar.
Thanks, everybody.